Welcome, Rod Driver. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Thank you very much for having me on again.
And thank you for coming on. Human rights this week, looking at specifically the US and the UK and how they've interpreted human rights, and in many cases how human rights is probably nowhere near the top of their agenda. Over to you, Rod.
That's a nice little sort of one-sentence summary. So human rights gives us a great topic to look at the sort of double standards of what our politicians and our media say. So if I begin by just talking very briefly about how history is a form of propaganda that completely misrepresents what's gone on in the past, and it completely tries to hide the atrocious human rights record of advanced nations such as Britain, France, and America. So if we go back to someone like Christopher Columbus, who's celebrated in a very positive way. In fact, the purpose of his voyage across the Atlantic was plunder. And in fact, he helped begin the transatlantic slave trade. And he also was part of what became the genocide of the people of Haiti. And then if you look at Francis Drake, who is celebrated in a positive way, he was actually a pirate. And some people will have heard of the explorer Henry Stanley, who most famous for the expression, or celebrated for the expression, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. But in fact, he helped King Leopold of Belgium exploit the resources of the Congo. And King Leopold had a track record of cutting off the hands of large numbers of people in the Congo. And Henry Stanley's main role there was to encourage the people in the Congo to sign treaties that they did not understand, handing over their resources. So if you actually analyze British history honestly, it's extremely negative. There are human rights atrocities everywhere. So if we come a bit more up to date, you could argue that throughout, say, the 20th century, up until 2001, there was perhaps a steady improvement in human rights in many countries and around the world. So if you begin with the elimination of slavery and then you come forward, you've got more and more people being given the right to vote. You've got women being treated as equals. You've got minorities, let's say in America, with Black people being given equal rights and so on. And then if you look at how prisoners are treated, they're treated far, far better than they were in the past. And throughout much of the 20th century, there was a spell where each year one or two countries would remove the death penalty. So you could say there was gradual, slow progress throughout that period. So if we talk about one of the most important things that happened in the 20th century, in 1947, just after the end of the Second World War, a number of powerful countries got together and created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is actually a very long list of important rights, such as the right to life and freedom from slavery or freedom from torture. But it's important to note that many of the most powerful nations of the time, so Britain, America, and France, violated many of these rights frequently. So if you look at British colonies, there was widespread murder, rape, and torture going on right up until approximately the early 1970s. So if we come forward to the present day, it's fairly clear that since the terrorist attacks on September the 11th, 2001, human rights generally have gone backwards. So America was able to start flying people around to be tortured, and governments have come up with more and more oppressive laws to justify what they do. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is the propaganda element of human rights, because it's incredibly powerful. So although the media don't say this, they've conditioned most people to think that human rights is about what a government does within their own borders. But actually, to properly analyze human rights, you have to include what they do outside their own borders. And this is almost never discussed by the media. And when you include what happens outside a country's own borders, it becomes very obvious that the United States and Britain are easily the worst offenders in terms of their international human rights records, because they destroy nations on a regular basis. So we've talked about this before, that Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and using Saudi Arabia as their proxy, they've destroyed Yemen. So grotesque scale of human rights. So we need to start thinking about war as mass murder, which violates the right to life, one of the most important rights of the UN Declaration. So there are one or two specific examples of the United States committing human rights atrocities that are worth mentioning. They both occurred in 1991. So some of you may remember that Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991. This is sometimes described as the beginning of Gulf War I. And there was an agreement that the Iraqi military would withdraw from Kuwait, and they were all returning. There were thousands and thousands of vehicles and soldiers returning on a number of roads running from Kuwait to Iraq. Now, an American representative, Marlin Fitzwater, gave an undertaking that the Americans would not attack retreating soldiers, but in fact, they proceeded to do so. And so in the worst sort of road that was attacked, the Americans attacked vehicles at the front of this huge column of approximately 2,000 vehicles and destroyed the vehicles at the back. And there was soft sand on either side of the road. So the vehicles had nowhere to go. And then American airplanes just spent the whole day flying backwards and forwards along this length, approximately a 20-mile stretch of road, just slaughtering everybody. And then the American ground troops went and buried all the bodies before most reporters arrived. So one or two reporters got there very quickly and noticed not only the carnage and the dead bodies everywhere, but also the people being buried very quickly. And then also in 1991, America invaded Iraq, and they were burying alive large numbers of soldiers using bulldozer blades. Many of these people were conscripts, many of them were trying to surrender, but the Americans just killed them anyway. And then also American airplanes were dropping napalm from the air into the trenches. And the staff of the American General Norman Schwarzkopf estimated that approximately 50 to 70,000 people had been killed in approximately 70 miles of trenches. So this type of slaughter by the American military is almost never mentioned by the mainstream press. There's a huge double standard here when looking at world events. So if you go back to 1995, in Srebrenica, there was some approximately 8,000 people were killed. And this is often described as the Srebrenica genocide. But if you look at the Iraqi city of Fallujah in 2004, the American military did to Fallujah certain things that were very similar to what happened in Srebrenica. So the military surrounded the city and then went and killed everybody inside. And in fact, the slaughter in Fallujah has been compared to the firebombing of Dresden in the Second World War, where huge numbers of people were killed with firebombs. So America commits these mass slaughters and nobody mentions them, whereas if somebody who's considered to be what's known as an official enemy of Britain and America commits an atrocity, then that's labeled a genocide. So there's a very clear double standard going on there with the reporting. So if we go back to the period 1945, again, just after the Second World War, there were some very important trials after World War II where the German leaders were prosecuted for their crimes. And there were three groups of crimes that they were prosecuted for. So they were crimes against peace, that means going to war in the first place, crimes against humanity, which means mass murder, and then breaking the rules within war. Now, again, this was very hypocritical because the US and Britain had regularly broken all of those rules before the Nuremberg trials and regularly broke all of those rules after those trials. So what you realize is that we have what's called victor's justice, where Britain and America are so powerful, they can pretty much do what they want to do in terms of human rights atrocities with no penalty, but they can then use human rights laws to prosecute others. So we need to recognize, very importantly, that starting a war encompasses every violent act that follows. And this is why going to war in the first place, or crimes against peace, were considered to be such an important crime at Nuremberg. And yet America has started war after war with Britain fighting alongside, and this is never mentioned. So Noam Chomsky, the famous American critic, has suggested that every US president would have been found guilty of extremely serious crimes if he were judged by the same standards as Nuremberg. And one of the things to bear in mind is that many of the laws that relate to these crimes exist in international law, but people in Britain can't use them to prosecute British leaders, and American people can't use them to prosecute American leaders because they're not ratified into domestic law. And this is one way in which very powerful people can basically operate outside the law. So there's a writer who's written an excellent book called Humanitarian Imperialism, who's pointed out that once war begins, there are no rules. And he suggested that if you look at the media having very complex debates about the rules within war, there's all sorts of debates about whether a soldier was firing on somebody who was unarmed, or the circumstances under which a soldier did one thing or another, that actually debating these small scale crimes is a form of war propaganda, because it shifts the blame onto individual soldiers, and it avoids talking about the real culprits, who are the politicians who take us to war in the first place. And so Jean Bricmont has suggested that having these complex debates about the rules within war is a bit like debating whether a rapist should wear a condom. And actually the crime is the violent rape, and the detail relating to that is neither here nor there. We need to start thinking much more seriously as going to war in the first place as the real crime that we focus on. And very recently, we've had WikiLeaks to provide us with information about what actually goes on during wartime. And so we've had the Afghan war logs and the Iraqi war logs. And what they show very clearly is that every day American soldiers are involved in murdering and maiming people, many of them completely innocent, and then frequently covering up those crimes. So it's just an endless series of human rights atrocities and criminal activity once the war has begun. So you start to realize that the concept of human rights, as far as the British and American governments are concerned, is really just public relations. They ignore it whenever it suits them, and they will use it to demonize their enemies, again, whenever it suits them. So if we look at a couple of specific aspects of human rights atrocities that America and Britain are involved in, one of the most obvious is torture. And so torture is considered a crime in international law that is so extreme that it cannot be used under any circumstances, even in wartime. And people tend to assume that in Britain we don't do torture, but actually it was widely used in our colonies, and the evidence indicates that we've actively supported torture, whilst the Americans have been using it very recently. So if you look at the most famous military site where torture has been discussed, it's Guantanamo Bay, where they have what's called Camp X-Ray. And this has been described as a legal black hole. So in order to bypass existing rules on how prisoners of war are treated, the Americans came up with the concept of unlawful combatant, where they were arresting people, claiming that they were terrorists, and then putting them into Guantanamo Bay, where they basically have no rights. They're outside any existing legal systems. So they were tortured and they were denied access to lawyers. Now, over time, it's been realized that most of them are not guilty of any crimes. Vast majority of them, it turned out, were completely innocent. And the interesting thing about Guantanamo Bay is it reverses the existing legal system, in the sense that a very important part of the British and American legal systems is that we have a presumption that everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Whereas with something like Guantanamo Bay, people are just locked up and basically presumed guilty, and they never have a chance to demonstrate their innocence. Now, it turns out that approximately 8 former inmates from Guantanamo Bay have gone on to commit crimes. But some of the people who ran Guantanamo Bay have said, look, we treated them so badly when they were in there, even if they weren't criminals before they went in, you know, it's no wonder that some of them are committing crimes now. So another site that received some attention was the Iraqi site of Abu Ghraib, where photos came out showing American soldiers torturing prisoners there, and some were tortured to death. Now, some soldiers were prosecuted for this, but nobody at a high level was prosecuted. So once again, any focus on it, any discussion becomes a way to put the attention on the individuals who are operating locally, and it completely deflects attention away from the fact that actually the torture was part of the system. The idea that these people could be tortured was created by people very, very high up in the US administration. And a former commander of Abu Ghraib has admitted that probably 90% of the people who were there were innocent of any crime. And although British officials tend to deny that they have anything to do with torture, in fact, it's become very clear that sometimes they are present when other people are carrying out torture. So for them to say they're not actively involved is again a complete misrepresentation of what's really going on. And in fact, this was something that Craig Murray, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, has written about, in that when he blew the whistle on Britain and America actively supporting the Uzbek leadership whilst they were committing torture, the officials in Britain and America said, oh, well, we are aware that torture is going on, but it's nothing to do with us. And then Craig later discovered that the CIA were actually flying people in to Uzbekistan to be tortured. So again, their denials were just a smokescreen. So it's interesting to see how much propaganda there is in relation to torture. So some people will be familiar with the phrase extraordinary rendition, which is a way of kind of hiding what's going on. It means torture and kidnapping, and America has a global network of torture sites, and they use phrases like enhanced interrogation to mean torture, and so on. And it's not just Britain and America who participate in this. Evidence came out that many European countries were allowing their airfields to be used for the Americans to refuel aeroplanes that were flying people around the world to be tortured. So many senior people at the highest levels were well aware of what was going on and were aiding and abetting this. Now, one of the things that crops up when torture is discussed is people say, but what if there's a ticking bomb? So the ticking bomb scenario is this idea that somebody that you've captured knows that there is a bomb about to explode somewhere, it's going to kill lots of people, and the authorities think that person knows where the bomb is and knows how to defuse it, and so therefore they claim that torture is justified in that situation. But in fact, whole books have been written demonstrating how nonsensical this is in the real world, that it's never actually the case that you have an individual where you know for sure that they know about a ticking bomb and they know how to defuse it, and so on, that actually in the real world, torture is never about ticking bomb scenarios. In fact, there are more and more people who study this sort of thing saying, well, torture isn't even about information. A lot of the time, it's simply about ruling through fear. And a great deal of torture is carried out by governments who do not have any legitimacy. They're right-wing extremist governments, and they torture because they don't really have the consent of the people they're governing. They're there because they're backed by the US, who's helped manipulate politics in that country, and so on. So there's a second area that I'd like to look at alongside torture, which is sanctions. And so sanctions mean when there are some limits on trade with another country to bring about political change. Now, some people have described this as war by other means. So the most famous example of sanctions was when the Americans and various other countries put sanctions on Iraq in 1991. And they blockaded the country for approximately 12 years. And they stopped medicines getting into the country, and they stopped equipment getting in that was vital to maintain the sanitation systems. And some commentators describe what happened as infanticide, because it's estimated that 500,000 children died because of the sanctions. Now, people who support the sanctions often come forward and say, oh, we don't think it was the sanctions. We actually think it's what Saddam Hussein, who was the Iraqi leader at the time, did in his country in relation to the sanctions. But actually, 2 United Nations commissioners for human rights resigned because they knew it was the sanctions that were having these effects. And there was an investigation in the British Parliament in 2007 where a man called Carney Ross came forward and made a statement. So he was part of the group of people who implemented the sanctions. And he said, and I'm going to read the words out exactly because I think it's worth doing. The weight of evidence clearly indicates that sanctions caused massive human suffering among ordinary Iraqis, particularly children. We, the US and UK governments, were the primary engineers and defenders of sanctions and well aware of this evidence at the time, but we largely ignored it or blamed it on the Saddam government. We effectively denied the entire population a means to live. So that statement's really important because firstly, it shows how powerful sanctions can be. They really can have dramatic negative consequences on a whole nation. But also it shows how governments will lie about what is causing the harm in those countries that are targeted with sanctions. So in the present day, Britain and America have sanctions on Syria, Venezuela, and Iran, and it's causing very serious consequences there. Now, sometimes you'll hear in the media, a politician will say, bad things are happening in Venezuela, so we must do something. Now, I love this phrase, we must do something. I think it's one of the great propaganda phrases. So firstly, it implies that we, that is the British and American governments, are not currently doing anything. Well, in fact, that's never true. We're always there behind the scenes, often with sanctions, making life worse for people in those countries, often supporting opposition groups, often fueling protests, doing all sorts of things behind the scenes to overthrow a government. But it also, when British and American politicians say we must do something, what they're meaning is we want to be able to do something violent to overthrow the government. And if a normal person was saying, you know, how can we help people in a country like Venezuela, the last thing we would do would be something violent. But the phrase we must do something is also an important propaganda phrase to help understand how propaganda works, because you take a word like we that politicians use and they're trying to pretend that ordinary people like you and I are the same as the leadership. Now, if I was running Britain and was trying to work out how to help people in Venezuela, it wouldn't involve all sorts of criminal activity. When politicians say they want to do something, it actually tends to be criminal activity. And they're trying to get us to see the world, to see everyone in Britain as a single kind of unified whole, all working together for the betterment of mankind. And of course, that's not the case. Our politicians and ordinary people have very, very different interests. So we can see this when we look at Britain and America supporting other leaders who commit very serious human rights abuses. So I've mentioned in a previous presentation about how the leadership of Indonesia committed genocide twice, and we were actively supporting them. So clearly, in those situations, human rights does not matter. Nigeria and Colombia, the governments commit widespread murder, but still we support them. And often people say that the American leader, President Carter, was much more moderate in his foreign policies. But in fact, even under him, it was recognized that some countries that were close allies of the US, so this would include, at the time, China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Saudi Arabia, were considered to be off limits in terms of criticism for their human rights records, because they were considered so important to the US administration. So another propaganda technique that governments use is to deny knowledge of atrocities when these leaders are doing something wrong. So Idi Amin in Africa committed monstrous atrocities in the 1970s. Britain supported him, and the British government over and over again denied knowledge of what was going on. And so this happens over and over again. Okay, the final point that I want to finish with is something that never gets discussed in the media. And this is our failure to discuss economic rights. Now, one of the most important parts of the 1948 United Nations Declaration on Human Rights was what's known as security of person. So this means the right not to starve, not to die of preventable diseases. And this is one of those things that is just sort of, it's as if it's disappeared from the memories of everybody in the media. They never talk about this, that actually, if you look at our foreign policies, not just the military policies, but our economic policies, which we'll talk about a lot in future presentations, you realize that the economic policies that we impose on many of the poorest countries actually contribute to the ongoing starvation and widespread diseases that kill large numbers of people there. And we could end these very, very easily if we chose to do so. So there's a quote by somebody who lived under the Argentinian military dictatorship in the 1970s. So if you remember, from 1976 to 1982, Argentina was ruled by a brutal military dictatorship, and they tortured and murdered large numbers of people. But the commentator, whose name is Rodolfo Walsh, said, and again, I'm going to quote him, "These events," meaning torture and murder, "are not, however, the greatest suffering inflicted on the Argentinian people, nor the worst violation for human rights which you have committed. It is in the economic policy of this government where one discovers a greater atrocity which punishes millions of people through planned misery." And I think that's a great quote for sort of summarizing what goes on internationally in terms of economic issues, where the idea of economic rights has just completely disappeared from the discourse of our leaders and the mainstream media. And yet, if we could manage to get it back to being a topic that we could talk about openly, among everyone, then people would start to realize that our economic policies overseas cause immense harm. Okay, I think that's a good time to wrap up the human rights presentation, Jason.
Fabulous, Rod. Thank you so much. Yeah, and a whole catalogue, as usual, of examples and explanations. Far too many for me to sort of go back over now, but I've just noted a few things. One of the big issues I always have is this idea that from a macro structural perspective, we blame the system and we blame the people that run the system. From a micro perspective, people are much more likely to blame the individuals. So you get the transference, as you identify, that transference of blame from the top down to scapegoats, if you like, that could be presented to the media, put on trial, either found guilty or not guilty, which enables the people who run the system to distance themselves, as you've identified throughout this presentation, from these multiple abuses. But I think there's a third way. I think we have to acknowledge that with the information being out there, and for many people who sign up to join the forces, whatever that force might be, that they have to take at least some responsibility. So that in essence, if we put, as you rightly say, if we put the individuals lower down on trial, we should also put those who turn a blind eye, who gave initial orders, etc. They should also go on trial. And also the system goes on trial for the fact that that is an outcome. But I think it's important that we don't forget that people, even though they've been socially conditioned, that there's plenty of people who don't sign up to join the forces, who have also been victims, if you like, of social conditioning, that have chosen not to for a whole range of reasons, but many of them related to the fact that they don't want to go out there. And as we talked about last week, we're all quite on the Western Front, they don't want to go out there and kill people that they've never met based on a powerful group of people's ideology or sociopathy. So I just wanted to get that out there, really, that, you know, that we need to make sure that the blame is apportioned in all the right places and that justice takes place in all the right places.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, and in fact, you know, I think it applies quite generally as well. So not just kind of to war crimes, but also to the way whole economies run. And I get very frustrated with quite a lot of reasonably well-off middle-class people that whenever there's an issue about what life is like for poorer people, so it can be in this country, it can be people queuing at food banks, it can be homelessness on the streets, that they pretend it's nothing to do with them and they just kind of ignore it. Whereas in fact, if the sort of middle class in general pretend that these things are nothing to do with them, then it will never change. And it's only when more people start to say, well, okay, I am part of this society and this government essentially represents me. And if there are things that should not be happening, we all need to work together to change them. And so that means to stop the war crimes and the invasions, but also to stop homelessness and to end poverty and so on. That there are, people just are not willing to recognize their own responsibility for a great many things that go on. And that's something I find incredibly frustrating. But I've never had any success at persuading the vast majority of people that I talk to who are not already critical to think much more critically about the world. And I one day hope that somebody will come up with a way of getting more people to think more critically about their role in the world.
And I think it has something to do with the nature of aspirational ideology, because whenever you aspire, you tend to, you know, metaphorically reach up. You don't aspire to reach down. So your focus is eternally very, from your egocentricity, very much about escaping from where you are or moving on from where you are, but moving and elevating yourself. And then, of course, you're being sold the idea that if you are capable of elevating yourself, then everybody else is capable of elevating themselves. And if they don't elevate themselves, it's down to them.
Yeah.
And bringing that in sort of in tune with what you've been talking about, it relates also to, let's think about, for example, being a fighter pilot. In order to be a fighter pilot, you generally probably have to get straight A grades in maths, physics, etc., in order to get in to the training program. Now, if you look at where A grades come from, they generally come from the middle classes. So what you have is you have the middle classes who aspire to this perceived high status role of being a pilot, a fighter pilot, which we know involves barbarism, which we know involves, you know, flying at 25,000 feet and releasing a whole shed load of bombs that you'll never be witnessing in terms of the impact because you're so high above the ground, but you're directly responsible for. So that aspirational thing here is to aspire to be a killer.
Indeed, absolutely.
And it's given high status, Rod. It's not looked down upon, it's looked up.
I think that's a really good point. And do you know, the funny thing is, I often think about fighter pilots, because when I was, just in case readers, not readers, people watching aren't aware, until I was about 35, I never really questioned seriously anything that went on around me. So it's not as if I sort of was aware of this stuff all of my life. My views have completely changed in the last 20 years. But I do remember when I was young, thinking how cool it would be to be a fighter pilot and to join the RAF. And I actually had a friend in class who was going to become a fighter pilot. And it never occurred to me to question what those people actually do in wartime. And I think it's part of everyone's conditioning when they're young, that on the whole, we just accept all of these things. It's sort of part of our society and we just accept it. And it's only when something happens to make us question these things. And as you say, with the fighter pilot thing, it's not just sort of there in the background. As you say, it is an aspirational thing. They are very, very highly regarded. And we do need to try to sort of get the message out as widely as possible, ideally at a school level, to say to people, let's question the whole fighter pilot thing as part of questioning lots of other things. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and if you think back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the dropping of a little boy, as it was called, by Enola Gay initially in Hiroshima, a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion in terms of the philosophy of ethics and more broadly have taken place around whether the bomb should have been dropped or whatever. But ultimately, if no pilot had said, I'm prepared to do it, it wouldn't have happened.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, it would be great if we had more people who would refuse to basically do the military things. So the bomber pilots, but also the military in general. And I'm quite pleased to see, and this is something that we will probably talk about in future editions, that there are organizations in both Britain and America with names like Veterans for Peace and Veterans Against War, which is former soldiers coming forward and say, actually, this war is very different from what's presented by the media and by the politicians. It is the mass slaughter of women and children. And the basic training of soldiers is brainwashing to make you believe it's okay to kill perfectly innocent people. And so it's good to see those organizations. Hi, I can see. Hello again. Hi. We just lost the recording there. I don't know at what point. So it's really great, I think, that we've got organizations in Britain and America with names like Veterans Against War and Veterans for Peace, who are former soldiers who are coming back to tell everyone that war is not like the presentation in the media or what politicians tell us, that it is the mass slaughter of women and children, and that we have to start changing what we do. And they're starting to also explain how what soldiers do in their first few months of basic training is brainwashing to make them believe that it's okay to murder innocent human beings in other countries. So I think we need to start listening to groups like that much more often and help them get a platform so we can get that message out more widely.
And I think just to finish off, Rod, I think helping them get a platform is the key issue, isn't it? Because the corporate media generally aren't interested. So it's then left to peripheral media, and it's left to those people, those charitable groups who have the money to be able to find ways of disseminating this information outwards into the education system and more broadly wider society. But until that becomes much more normal, challenging the stranglehold of the sociopathic warmongers is going to be extremely difficult.
I think that's true, yeah. So I mean, I think it's great what you do on 10 by 6, that it gives people a platform to express views that nobody hears on the mainstream media. So we need to make this as widespread as possible.
Absolutely, and I hope that it's not just about expressing views, it's about expressing informed understanding of situations that can educate and alleviate ignorance, because much of what they get and what they experience elsewhere does not have that raison d'etre.
I agree, actually, and I think this is one of the things about the mainstream media, that if you give a different point of view, they will often say, well, that's just your opinion. But actually what's going on in the mainstream media, firstly, is their opinion, but secondly, has no evidence to back it up. And so it does need to be challenged.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rod. Another brilliant week, another brilliant program.
Thanks again.
Conversation with you, and we'll talk next week.
Okay, see you next week.